Shalom, everyone. The Gemara in Kiddushin is touching not only the relationship between a man and a woman in the holy bond of marriage, but also the relationship between people and their parents in the mitzvah of kibbudorim, and also in the pages between page 14 to 24. We hear about the Sugya, about the topic of slavery in Am Yisrael regarding to Jewish slaves and to foreign slaves. And the idea of the fact that we have slavery in the Torah is definitely a difficult one. Like, what do we do with that we know today that it's an immoral thing? And how did the Torah address that? So in the short time that we have, I would like to touch that issue, but also mention that not only does the Gemara pay a lot of attention to the topic of slavery, also the Rambam in Mishneh Torah, there's 9 chapters regarding to the halachot, the laws of slaves, of Hebrew slaves and non-Jewish slaves. And the Torah also addresses that topic in 3 different places. And let me share the screen and we'll dive right into that. So I will start with quoting the Mishnah in page 14 in our Gemara in Kiddushin. And the Mishnah says the following: a Hebrew slave can be acquired by his master through money or through a document, and he can acquire himself. In other words, he can free himself through years, meaning that when he completes the 6 years of labor, or through the jubilee, Shnat Yovel, the jubilee year, or through the deduction of money. In other words, he's giving the master the money that has left for the years that he have left of slavery. And that little Mishnah is opening a whole long discussion in the Gemara in terms of a Hebrew slave and not a Hebrew slave, the difference between men slaves and women Jewish slaves. But I want to show first the psukim in the Torah that regarding slaves. So we start with Exodus and the Gemara and the Torah in Sefer Shmot, in the beginning of Parashat Mishpatim. The first law in the long list of laws that we have in Parashat Mishpatim is in terms of Jewish slaves. Ki tikne eved ivri, when you acquire a Hebrew slave, the person shall serve 6 years and shall go free in the 7th year without payment. In other words, the Torah limits the time that a person can be a slave to another person, and he goes freely. That's the first time. The second time is in Vayikra, in Parashat Behar. Parashat Behar in Vayikra starts with the laws of Shemitah, and speak to the Israelite people, say to them, when you enter the land that I assign to you, the land shall observe a Shabbat, and that's Shemitah. And then it goes in length to talk about the Jubilee year, the laws of the Jubilee year. And then we go straight into the laws of Avadim. If your kin under you continue in straits and must be given over to you, do not subject them to the treatment of a slave. In other words, the circumstances sounds a little bit odd. What does that mean, that he must be given over to you? That's one thing that we'll see in the halacha, but also do not subject them to the treatment of slaves. In other words, the treatment that the Hebrew slave gets from his master is different than everything that knows around. And here I want to stop and say that we definitely know that in the ancient world, the treatment of slaves and the approach towards slaves throughout the ancient world was such of, they belong to the master. The master owns them and their body, and they can do to them whatever they want. Not only does the time of slavery is not limited, but the master can torture the slave and hurt his body and soul as well. And here, the Torah, there's a new message. There's a new idea in terms of slavery. Slavery must be limited. and slavery must be, and the relationship between a slave and a master must be humane. And we'll see it in the Rambam in a minute. And another thing which is very interesting, that the Torah's approach towards the slave is as remaining with you as a hired or bound labor. In other words, not your slave, but the person you hired to do a certain job. And of course, when the Jubilee year comes, you have to let him free, him and his family as well. And then the chapter in Vayikra ends with three very important statements and verses. Ki avadaihem, for they are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt, and they may not give themselves over into servitude. And you shall not rule over them ruthlessly. You shall fear your God. And for it is to me that the Israelites are servants. They are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. I am your God. So it's very, very clear. So that's what the Torah tells us in terms of the laws of slaves, of Hebrew slaves. There's also, we're not going to touch the Evet Knaani, but also they have their own specific rules and laws which are different than what we know from the surrounding. Slavery begins. We hear about slaves in Shumer, and of course in Bavel, and later on in Rome. The slavery gets a little bit different, but it's an institution, and there's a different hierarchy between the layers of the society, between the masters, the soldiers, and the slaves. And here in the Torah, there's new sounds, new voices in terms of slaves. And the most immediate thing is, people can be only slaves and serve God, but not other people. And the idea that we can only serve God and not serve other people is definitely going back to the beginning of Bereshit, by the fact that God created every human being in his image. So that's why, like, the necessity to behave humanely towards another person is because you and the servant and the slave both were created in the image of God, and we have no right over their body and over their soul and over their life. And that's why it's limited time. It's for a limited time. And also there are very strict laws saying that, for example, if the master hurt the body of the slave immediately can be released from the slavery. And what I want to show you as well is how the Rambam, giving us the list of like the many, many, many details, but I chose the details which I think are crucial in order to understand the approach of Judaism and the Torah towards slavery. And the Rambam in Hilchot Avadim, in the laws of slaves, is saying the following. First, he says the term Hebrew servant used by the Torah refers to a Jew whom the court sells by compulsion, or a person who sells himself willingly. In other words, there are no slave markets that people can buy people. In Jewish law, there are only two circumstances that one can become a slave. Either, for example, someone stole and was caught and have no money to pay for his theft, so the court, the Beit Din, can sell him to be a slave for him to pay back what he owns. In other words, it's under the rule of the court. That's one circumstance. And then the other one is someone who got to a very low place of no money, cannot support his family at all, can sell himself to be a slave. And again, it's for very limited time. And continues the Rambam and says, we have already explained that a woman is never sold because of a theft. Okay, this exclude women. Women cannot sell themselves or be sold sold by the Beit Din. Similarly, she may not sell herself as a servant, nor may she purchase a Hebrew servant or a Canaanite servant because of the suspicion of immoral behavior. Okay, and a Hebrew servant who is sold by the court, he's sold only to a native-born Israelite or to a convert. And neither a person who sells himself nor one who is sold by the court should be sold in public on an auction block, nor in an alley as slaves are sold. In other words, there is a very specific order. Like, it's different. We use the name Eved, but it's not like the Avadim. It's not like the slaves around you in Moab or in Canaan, later on in Rome or in Babel, in Persia. No, these are different. They're not slaves. They serve you for a certain amount of time. And that's why you shouldn't act to them. You shouldn't behave to them. You shouldn't sell them, in an auction or in an alley, because it says he shall not be sold as a slave is sold. Instead, he should be sold in a private and honorable manner. And is forbidden to make any Hebrew servant perform excruciating labor. And this is again avodat parech, that's the Hebrew. And again, Egyptian used avodat parech on the Jews. And a person, the whole exodus from Egypt was to say that no person may enslave another person and take their time and use their time and body for their own purposes. It's only, and if we serve, it's only serving God. So we shouldn't enslave them and give them harsh and hard work, avodat parech. And when a Jew purchases a Hebrew servant, he may not take him perform debasing tasks as that are relegated only for servants. For example, to have him carry his clothes or bath hose, or remove his shoes. In other words, this person works for you, is not your slave. Okay, and this is very, very, very important. And instead, one should treat him as a hired labor. And a master is obligated to treat the Hebrew servant or maid servant as his equal with regard to food, drinks, clothing, and living quarters. And the Tosfot says, for example, that if the master has only one pillow, he should give the pillow to the servant. And that makes the Gemara also, this whole idea of how you should treat the servant with as equal. Also, the Gemara will tell us that they understand that when you buy a slave, when you buy a servant, it's as if you buy a master to yourself, because you have to be so careful of what he can do and what he can do and how you should behave towards. And we'll see it in a minute. And a master is obligated to treat as equal. And the institution, and that's very important, the institution of a Hebrew maid servant and that of a Hebrew servant is not practiced except in the time when the Jubilee year is observed. In other words, we can't really have servants and slaves today. And this is saying, like the Rambam, this is the Alcha in the Rambam, reflecting on the Gemara, and the Rambam in the 12th century, when around him in Spain and in Africa, of course, everyone is trading slaves. And here the Hebrew law is saying, we can't do it right today, so we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it at all. And we do know that people, Jews were slaves in other Jews' houses, and trying to keep the laws as much as they can. But okay, this is what I was talking about in Kiddushin. He acquires a master for himself. But I want to move on and finish with a moral statement. In other words, we all feel very uncomfortable, thinking that there's laws of slavery in the Torah. And I think that when we regard the fact that the Torah was given in a certain time, a certain age, and around it the slavery was something very common and very obvious and very normal and very accepted. And the Torah is softening and limiting, that institution of slavery and how to treat slaves. And that brings many, many, many commentators throughout the generations to try to understand, the role of slavery in the Torah. Is it forever, or is it something that is good, that we feel today that it's not appropriate and we change it? And I brought in front of you a quote from Rav Nachum Rabinovich Zatzal, the Rosh Yeshiva of Ma'ale Adumim. And here he bases his words on top of upon the Rambam, because the Rambam says that there are two types of mitzvot. Like, there are some mitzvot that we keep that are forever. Like, keeping and sticking to those mitzvot elevates us and makes us a better people, and doesn't matter what's happening around. These are forever. And some of the mitzvot are there to help us get rid of bad behavior or routine, or things that were true to a certain time. And the more we go deep in Torah, and the more we move on in history, there's something about morality that comes out of life that helps us understand that thing was temporary, and now it's time to behave differently. And the way that Rav Rabinovich is saying it is the following: in the course of time, knowledge grew throughout the world. New discoveries in science and technology have created new sources of energy, far exceeding manpower, and great welfare became possible. Okay, in other words, maybe in the past, manpower and labor and slaves were necessary for to do things. But definitely today, when we have so much technology and we don't need so much manpower, and also the knowledge grew. In other words, knowledge is also being very, very getting wise, and understand that there's certain things that are not fit in the way that we live today. And the supreme providence brought about the abolition of slavery in almost all nations. And by the way, we need to say, the abolition of slavery in modern world also took time. It's only the 18th century that some countries in Europe finishing with slavery, and at the beginning of the 19th century, other countries, joined them. And it's also in the middle of the 20th century that United Nations is having a decree, to fight against slavery in humanity. It took time. And that, says Rav Rabinovich, are not things we should ignore. Something about the level of humanity come to understand that the deep message, which is the initial message, which is the most important message of Bereshit, that people were created in the image of God. And God, and he says, it's a supreme providence that brought about the abolition of slavery in almost all nations. And blessing is God that radiated the light of Torah and taught those who were lost to recognize the greatness of God inherent in every human being. And the abolition of slavery is only a partial realization of the sublime idea that the Torah taught us. And anyone who knows a chapter in the annals of the Western world, it is clear to him that one of the decisive factor in this process was the spread of knowledge of the Torah. And all of this is to rectify the whole world, to worship God together, as it is written in Zephaniah, כי אז יהפוך אל עמים שפה ורורה, לקרוא כולם בשם אדוני ולעובדו שכם אחד, for then I will make the people pure of speech, so that they all invoke God by name and render service with one accord. And of course, what Rav Rabinovich is referring here is the fact that all the Abrahamic religions that came from the Torah and embodied that idea of Tzelem Elokim, and it is true that in Europe, in the modern time in Europe, it was English, it was Christian English clerks that raised the voice against slavery, and French people and in America, etc., etc. And they all, it was the light of the Torah, as Rabinovich is saying. And the idea is that definitely no one should enslave another person. And the Torah started with, with limiting the behavior towards a slave. But today we definitely can say in a loud voice that slavery, avdut, is not something that we should continue to be occupied with.